I was thinking the other day, a journalist asked me why people are responding so positively to what I'm saying, the young men, for example, and I thought, why? Yeah, that's a good question. He says, well, I'm actually on their side. I'm really happy that they're not wasting their lives. I'm really sad to see that people are disenchanted and nihilistic and depressed and anxious and aimless and perverse and vengeful and all of those things. It's terrible. And then to see people question whether that's necessary and then to start to rise out of it. It's like, it's so fun. Like last night I was after my talk, it's overwhelming.
Be careful who you share good news with. That's a good one. Because you want to share good news with people who are going to be genuinely happy for you, and that's one way that you can identify those people who are truly on your side.
Wow.
It's
powerful.
There was a corollary to that, which was be careful who you share bad news with, because that's equally tricky. You want someone who will listen to you when you're having trouble and allow you your grief, especially if it's a consequence of something tragic, and who won't try to one-up you, because often when you're talking to people, they'll be thinking about what they have to say that's worse, and that's not helpful if you need a listening ear. Make one room in your house as beautiful as possible. That's what I'm writing about now. I talked a lot already about the necessity of cleaning your room, which is, in some sense a foolish piece of advice because it seems so obvious, but it's not obvious at all. And you'll find if you try it, especially if you're in a household that's not very functional, that you'll encounter obstacles that you couldn't imagine existed while you're trying to put your life in order. And you can take your surroundings beyond order and move towards beauty, and that's unbelievably useful because, well, beauty calls people to their higher being, I would say, and to make friends with beauty is to introduce yourself very carefully to one of the mysteries of life that make it worth living. And so those are a few of the rules that didn't make the original cut, but that I'm still working on and still thinking about.
I'm definitely looking forward to reading the next book that you come out with. Those were very interesting rules. Appreciate you for sharing it with us. Thank you for sharing it with us. So there's this saying that says, tough times produce strong men produce good times produce weak men produce tough times.
Yes.
If that's the truth, which phase are we in today?
Well, if you think about it historically, you have to say that we're in good times. I mean, that doesn't mean everything about the current times are good, and of course life is always tenuous and difficult, but it's 1919. If you go back 100 years ago, imagine what the last 5 years would have been like, right? The entire world was encapsulated in a terrible war. The trench warfare was absolutely brutal, and that was a 5-year period, and then that was followed by the Spanish influenza, which killed 120 million people. And, so I'd rather be here now than there then by a substantial margin. And I think life is never easy, even under relatively positive conditions. But I would say that it's very difficult to make the case that we're not in good times. And I especially think that's true if you look at the world globally. The American working class, and maybe the Western working class in general, paid a very large price for enriching the rest of the world. China's come up in a miraculous way in the last 40 years, South Korea, India, while the entire all of Southeast Asia, and increasingly Africa too, because the fastest growing economies in the world are now in sub-Saharan Africa. And that's produced a tremendous competition for working class people in the West. But speaking on a global level, there's never been a better time for the majority of people to be alive. And the future, although we're vulnerable and terrible things can always happen to us, it's hard to make a case that the future doesn't look comparatively positive.
So if you want to be the best at what you're doing, bar none, then having an IQ of above 145 is a necessity, and maybe you're pushing 160 in some situations, and maybe that's making you one person in 10,000 or even one person in 100,000. And then also, to really be good at it, you probably have to be reasonably stress tolerant and also somewhat conscientious. So you know, people, and you think, well, why is it that smart people are at the top of dominance hierarchies? It's because I'll tell you what it is that you need to do to be successful. Some of these things aren't so malleable, but others are things that you can work on. Well, IQ, well, that's a rough one, because there's no evidence, as far as I can tell, that you can do a damn thing about your IQ. I was just reading a paper by Dan Simon today. It's a relatively recent review. Dan Simon did the Invisible Gorilla stuff, and he was looking, because there's all these companies that claim that these online brain training exercises can produce cognitive improvements, and he reviewed the literature again, and I've reviewed that literature like 6 times in the last 15 years because I keep hoping that someone will crack the problem, but it's always the same answer. It's like, you do brain training games, you get better at the game, a lot better at that game. You get slightly better at similar games, but distal games that are still heavily cognitively loaded doesn't affect your performance at all. Zero, none.
Most creative people fail at producing their creative product and monetizing it, right? So your default position, if you're a creative person, is you're going to fail. And that's because it's hard to come up with something new, and it's hard to present it to the market at the right time, and it's hard to market it. Like, those things are really, really difficult. And so what successful entrepreneurs do is they just keep doing it over and over and over and over and over and over and over. And eventually, if they're fortunate, one of their ideas happens to hit the right place at the right time. And so that's also Darwinian in some sense. You know, you're creating all these little enterprises that are sort of alive. They're run by people, after all. And even if your idea is good, that doesn't mean it will be successful. There's so many things that have to be taken into account. So this is partly why persistence, and that's part of conscientiousness, is so useful. It's like, you know, what do they say? If at first you fail, then try again. And that would probably mean try something different rather than the same thing. But persistence is helpful because it enables you to run many, many experiments. And you need to know that the baseline is failure. You know, it's important, because otherwise you'll blame that on yourself. You know, and some of that's useful because there's probably some things that you could improve about yourself.